Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat network. Our topic of discussion today is an introduction to Hungarian Romanticism, and friends, for this very discussion and lecture we have with us in our studio Dr. Margit Koves. She teaches Hungarian language and literature in the Department of Slavonic and Finno-Ugrian Studies, University of Delhi. She has been teaching in the same university since 1983. Also, she was a fellow of Indian Council of Historical Research, Indian Council of Philosophical Research and Indian Council of Social Science Research. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studio and also request her to begin our today's lecture. Thank you so much for coming, ma'am.
Thank you, Urvashi. This lecture is about Romanticism and Hungarian Romanticism. In our everyday conversation, we often speak about a romantic person. Somebody who is young and emotional and full of feeling. In this lecture, we speak about a movement which is present in all literatures of Europe and also in India in the form of Chayavad. That's Mahāshveti Verma's literature. We know that it is part of Chayavad Romanticism, Indian Romanticism. Romanticism encompasses a worldview. You could also say a philosophy, art, literature, and music. The French writer Victor Hugo, himself a famous romantic writer and poet, called Romanticism the liberalism of literature. That means the liberation of the artists and writers from the conventions of social life and the rules and conventions of art and literature. Romanticism is a wide-ranging movement that started in England and in Germany in the 18th century and in France. In Eastern Europe, in Hungary, that is our main focus today, it became predominant only in the 1820s and the 1830s. English and French Romanticism can be contrasted to a great extent to Classicism. But in Hungary, Romanticism went hand in hand with Classicism. Romanticism is also the time of the birth of national consciousness and a great interest in national history. Questions of culture and aesthetics were approached from the specific historical, social point of view given by the particular national surrounding. The name of the movement, Romanticism, comes from the French word roman, novel, that was used for romances. In 1798, in the German journal ATHENAEUM, a very apt definition can be read. It was formulated by the Jena philosopher FRIEDRICH Schlegel. Romantic poetry is a progressive universal poetry. Its destiny is not merely to reunite all of the different genres and to put poetry in touch with philosophy and rhetoric. Romantic poetry wants to and should combine and fuse poetry and prose, genius and criticism, art poetry and nature poetry. It should make poetry lively and sociable and make life and society poetic. It should poeticize wit and fill all of art's forms with sound material of every kind to form the human soul, to reanimate it with flights of humor. Romantic poetry embraces everything that is purely poetic, from the greatest art systems, which contain within them still more systems, all the way down to the sigh, to the kiss that a poeticizing child breathes out in an artless song. Romantic poetry can lose itself in what is represented to the extent that one might believe that it exists solely to characterize poetic individuals of all types. Schlegel used the term romantic for poetry that unites the separate forms of art and genres. Wordsworth and Coleridge in the in the preface to the lyrical ballads and text, which he writes a little more, Schlegel writes a little more, which I partly skip, but there is a very important part which I would like you to still remember, and that is about mythology. He says, "It is my contention that our poetry lacks a center, such as mythology was for the ancients, and the essential shortcomings of modern poetry in relation to that antiquity may be summed up in these words: we have no mythology. But let me add that we are close to acquiring one, or rather, it is time that we collaborate in producing one. For it will come to us in quite the opposite way from the original mythology, which was everywhere the first blossoming of youthful imagination, clinging directly to and rooting itself in what was most immediate and alive in the sensuous world. The new mythology must, on the contrary, be fashioned out of the profoundest depths of the spirit. It must be artificial of all works of art, for it is to encompass all others. It is to be a new course or a vessel for the ancient, eternal fountainhead of poetry, and itself the everlasting poem, which contains within itself of all other poems." So we see how he compares a new mythology with the old mythology, which is actually the mythology of the first mythology is the mythology of the Greeks, and he feels that the Romantic poet will create a new mythology in himself. In the preface of the lyrical ballad, the same year, 1798, Coleridge and Wordsworth defined good poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is also worthwhile to look at the preface of lyrical ballads because they speak in terms of mankind, and they also speak about the class of poetry, which will change now. He says, "A class of poetry would be produced, well adapted to the interest mankind permanently, and not unimportant in multiplicity and the quality of its moral relations." He writes about the state of public taste and justifies his turn, Wordsworth's turn, to a different strata of society, those who represent low and rustic life and less under the effect of social vanity. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that situation the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that situation our elementary feelings exist in a state of greater simplicity, and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated, because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings, and from the necessary character of rural occupation are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that situation the passions of man are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So we see how it meant, Romantic poetry meant the involvement of a much larger strata of society than classical poetry, than what classical poetry was meant for. It might be useful to collect a few characteristics of classicism and Romanticism. Of course, when you look at this sketch, you see that these are not, they look as compartments, but this is not the way we perceive them. So reason in classicism can be contrasted with feeling in Romanticism, common sense in Classicism is contrasted to imagination, nature to be tamed nature is a supreme organic force in Romanticism, man is a social being in Classicism, and in Romanticism it is and he is an individual creator. He is a godlike being, especially if it is about the artist. Art is craft, a skill which can be learned in the workshops of art and poetry. And in Romanticism, art is inspiration. In Classicism, we find a hierarchy in the literary canon, and Romanticism involves new genres. It fuses various genres, as what Wilhelm Schlegel spoke about. In Classicism, the person, the individual, is a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan person. In Romanticism, the nation, the aspect of the nation is more emphasized, and the poet is also the member of the nation, the man who speaks the same language as the other members of the nation. So liberalism was part of the political system in the modern age, in the ensuing modern age, after the 18th century, and it was the modern outlook of man and society. Part of liberalism is individualism, that places the interests of the individual above the interests of community. It was a great step ahead when liberalism transformed the relationship in feudal society, and ruler and the dependents became citizens. The state was considered a free union of citizens, ideally, the union of citizens by their constitutional interests. And it is supposed to serve the community of its members, the nation. The slogans of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, that means liberty, equality, and fraternity, express the ideas of political and legal equality and brotherhood, the unity of mankind. Now here we see a sketch of historical events which played an important role for the development of the Romantic movement. First, we see the French Revolution and its slogans. Second, we see that in contrast to this slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity, Napoleon was crowned as the absolute ruler in 1799. Next, Napoleon started on his campaign in Europe, and in 1806 he had a victory at Jena. Jena was exactly the place where Wilhelm Schlegel and his philosopher Franz formulated the program of Romanticism. Napoleon went against Russia in 1812, and we know how his army was stopped under Moscow by the heroic Russian peasants and soldiers. Napoleon also touched Hungary on his way towards Russia and Austria. From 1825 and 1848, the Age of Reform started in Hungary. This is one of the very relevant data for our today's lecture. We see how the work of various poets evolved during this period. In 1830, we have the July Revolution against the French monarchy. In France, Napoleon was in the meanwhile exiled to Sicily, and Charles X was appointed a ruler. Here we see Delacroix's painting, Liberty leading the people. You see the Amazon the absolutely classical beauty of liberty, holding in his right hand the French flag and his other hand the bayonet. On the streets of Paris, Paris was a medieval city at this time. On the streets of Paris you see different people of different strata lying together on the cobbles. These streets were really very tight and narrow, so the struggle was led, barricades were made, and the struggle evolved in the streets. You see on one stone you see the head of a high aristocrat. You see also his hat. From his clothing it's clear that he is part of the aristocracy, and somewhere else you see a person from whose clothing you can see that he's a worker from a workshop. But in the background of the painting you see the Notre Dame, the towers of the Notre Dame. The towers of the Notre Dame on this painting, in this copy, it is not seen very clearly, but it is there in the background, showing the heritage, the legacy of the feudalism in France. Romanticism, but we also know that in 1848 revolutions broke out all over Europe. The longest revolution took place in Hungary. In 1848, March the revolution itself, at the same time as the Austrian Revolution in Vienna, and it developed further into a freedom struggle which went on till September 1849. And in 1857, we know that the Indian Rebellion and freedom struggle broke out. So we see that there is some kind of parallel between these world historical events. Romanticism was a phase that pervaded art, culture, worldview, and the literature, of course, of Europe. It had the widest repercussions in literary and art movements. It means that even now, when discuss literary works, very often we relate it to Romanticism. For example, when we speak about Vikram Seth's novel, Golden Gate, a novel in verse, then very often we relate it to Pushkin's, the Russian poet's, Yevgeny Onegin, which was also a novel in verse. Or when we speak about Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children or The Moor's Last Sigh, we relate with their interesting mythology. We relate them often to the personal mythologies of Romanticism. In many ways, Romanticism is also the beginning of modernity, and there is a constant dialogue between our age and Romanticism. So we see how art, painting, and music were also suffused with the spirit of Romanticism. We saw the painting of Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, and Romantic painting also elaborated historical themes important for national history, and Delacroix was contributing in that sphere also. A German painter, Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes show distant locations. The main figure does not turn towards the viewer, it turns inside the picture. And not just inside the picture, we have the feeling that he's peering inside himself, in the various processes of his self, the processes of his soul. Here we see a Hungarian historical painting by BERTALAN, SZÉKELY. It is a painting done in 1860, but it recalls a historical event the history of the year 1552, when the Ottoman Turkish army attacked the fort of Eger, and the women of Eger heroically defended the fort. This was a critical moment of the defense of Eger fort, where the women came to the protection of the fort and were rolling down stones and hot water on the attacking army. The artist, the creative artist, was also a very important figure of painting. You see here Josef DANHAUSER's painting Franz Liszt at the piano. Franz Liszt was a Hungarian composer who lived most of his life abroad, but he composed much music on Hungarian themes, and he also used Hungarian gypsy music in his various musical pieces. The literature had a special influence on music. We can see this in the symphonic poem. For example, Berlioz's composition, the Faust overture, was a very famous piece. You know, Faust was written by Goethe, the classical romantic poet of Germany. There was an upheaval of the national opera and the integration of dance and music motifs of the music of various nations in the opera and in other forms of music. The musical genre of the nocturne became also popular. The nocturne, recalled the atmosphere of the night. This morning I'm going to speak about MIHÁLY VÖRÖSMARTY, a Hungarian poet who transformed Hungarian literature by recreating the language and entering the romantic spirit and using romantic and modern tools of expression. In his mystery play, Csongor és Tünde, Csongor, the male protagonist, goes in search of love and happiness until he finds Tünde. On his way, he has to overcome various obstacles. He meets Night, and Night addresses him with the following soliloquy. I only quote the beginning of the soliloquy. Darkness and void was all, myself alone, seclusive, silent, all-forsaken night. Then light was born to be, my only child, as a blazing light erupted from my womb, the boundless power of radiation. And so on. So Friedrich Schlegel, in his dialogue on poetry, argued by the development of mythological consciousness. Now we see how VÖRÖSMARTY created his own personal mythology. He is actually creating the birth of cosmos as a personal mythology in his poem. We spoke about the event of Napoleon defeating the Germans by Jena, and the Jena in 1806. And this year, the Jena Circle of Philosophy had to shift to another university, Heidelberg. Heidelberg became the center of German Romanticism. This was a new generation of philosophers who were exposed to the experience of Napoleonic wars. The universal aspect of Romanticism at this time was sidelined, and different dimensions of romantic thought came to the foreground. The work of Johann Gottfried Herder became very significant in this process. Herder looked at national languages and literatures as a variety of developments and qualities. He considered that each nation goes through a course of development, similar to the phases of life of a person: childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age. And each nation has reserves of originality, creativity, based on their past and based very significantly on their oral culture. Herder's work was especially significant for Hungarians. In his epoch-making book, Ideas for the Philosophy of the History of Mankind, which was published in 1774, and especially after its Hungarian publication in 1811, he contributed to the discussion to the implications of the geographical factors for the role of the psyche, national language, and nationhood. In France, nation was considered a political formation, but Herder perceived the nation linked to language, soil, landscape, and climate. This concept of nation was similar in Hungary to the Serbian, Bulgarian, Czech, and Albanian notions of nation, because they had more or less colonial status at this phase of history. If you look at this map, then you see how Germany was consisted of very many parts, of very many small states. The Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Croatia existed under the name Habsburg. Poland did not exist at all, and it was covered by Prussia and Russia. And Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania were under the Osmanian Turkish rule. So for these nations, state, language, literature, and these elements played a very different role from England and from France. This is what we call from the east of the Rhine, the dividing line for the national consciousness of these people. The issue of national survival, because Herder forecast that Hungarian as a language, lonely in the sea of Germanic and Slavic peoples, would have to face extinction. This deeply emotionalized the issue of language as a question of origins and the survival of the nation. And additional efforts were made when German was declared as an official language by Joseph II, the Habsburg ruler, in 1784. And this led to the suppression of Latin, which was the official language of Hungary at the time, and in the other lands, and also Hungarian, which at the time was very undeveloped. At this time, Hungarian nobility, along with the Polish nobilities, used Latin, and it was only in the 1840s that the language was developed enough to use in official correspondence, in the legal language and for the terminology of science. So the issue of national survival energized the movement for the renewal of Hungarian language. This movement, led by Ferenc Kazinczy, sought to create the phraseology and the vocabulary suited to expressing the technological, administrative, and intellectual culture of the age, and which would be capable of replacing Latin and German. His figure, Ferenc Kazinczy's figure, is very similar to the Hindi Harishchandra Bharatendu's figure, who was also working on the new vocabulary of Hindi language. Then many of their activities were also similar. In the course of, at this time, there was a Hungarian scholar by the name, and it was not only the language, it was also, in the case of Hungary, it was also the history, the past of Hungary. Hungarian, we know now that Hungarian is a Finno-Ugrian language. But at that time, the origins of Hungarian language and the past of Hungarians was not at all clear. And there were interests in two directions and search in two directions towards the Finno-Ugrian relationship, and also there was a search towards the East. So Alexander Csoma de Kőrös, who was a Transylvanian Hungarian, a so-called SZÉKELY, decided to search for the origins of Hungarians. This sounds a very fuzzy project, but luckily Csoma de Kőrös had excellent schools. He studied in the College of Nagyenyed, and later he got the English scholarship to Göttingen. Göttingen was one of the best universities in Europe, and he studied with the great scholars Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was an anthropologist, and Heinrich Klaproth, who was a historian. And he matched his plan with a lot of scholarship. And Eichhorn convinced him that he may look for the predecessors of Hungarians in the Arabic sources. Csoma decided to come to India, to the east, and search for the origins of Hungarians here, and from India, if it's necessary, to go to Central Asia. On the way, he met William Moorcroft, a British agent, and he enlightened Csoma that in the Tibetan chronicles he may find important information about the past of Hungarians. And Csoma went to Zanskar. He settled down with a Tibetan scholar, Sangye Puncog, first, and then he went in Zangla, and then in Kanam, and this led to the composition of the great Tibetan dictionary and Tibetan English dictionary and the Tibetan grammar, which are works which are still used by scholars, and he became one of the founding scholars of the scholarship Tibetan studies. And but Csoma even later, even in the preface of his dictionary, he was apologizing that he abandoned his researches respecting the origins and the language of Hungarians, and he claimed that he feels the deepest interest in pursuing the inquiry into the Hungarian language. Later he worked in the Asiatic Society as a librarian in Calcutta and went to Darjeeling to cross over to Central Asia to pursue his search for the predecessors of Hungarians. Unfortunately, in Darjeeling he got cerebral malaria passing through the Bengal, and this is where he died after 5 days of illness. So after this digression, now I would like to come back to the situation in Hungary. The publication of Hungarian journals and newspapers started in the beginning of the century, of the 19th century, but Hungary, like India at the time, was a colony, and censorship was very strongly exercised. One of the first journals which were released was by Ferenc Batthyány, who was one of the Hungarian Jacobins, the French followers of the French Revolution, the most radical wing of the French Revolution. He released Magyar Múzeum. His journal was banned after 1 year. Here is Batthyány, and you can see his poem on the changes in FRANZ. The other editor was Ferenc Kazinczy, who published a short-lived journal with the title Orpheus. Orpheus, Kazinczy was a Freemason, and his name in the movement was Orpheus. This is how he gave this title to his journal. He is the person whom he can compare, his activities we can compare to Bharatendra Harishchandra. Similarly to Harishchandra, Kazinczy was very active in translations and had a great influence in Hungarian literature through his correspondence with other writers. In the poem, Our Language, he expresses his concern about how my language has envied your beauties meaning the beauties of Polish languages, Spanish and Greek. But he also expresses at the end of his poem his belief that Hungarian would be a match with its flexibility, liveliness, and with its energy. Ferenc Kölcsey, another scholar, entered into correspondence with Kazinczy at the age of 18, and this was a life-changing event for him. Here you see him in a toga, in this Roman dress, and he was in the position of homo politicus. He was a member of parliament. The parliament opened in 1825, and he contributed with his great oratory in Hungarian language, and also with his various speeches and persuading the other members of parliament to contribute to public life. So he writes in his work MOHÁCS. MOHÁCS is the name of the great historical disaster, the name of the location where Hungarians suffered a defeat by the hands of the Turkish attackers in 1526. The Hungarians were decimated at this time, and in memory of this event, this was an anniversary, 300 years anniversary, he writes in his piece, "What binds you together now as a mass of people? Where is the spirit which inflames every bosom? Your theatres, they are the tents of wandering fugitives, where in any case all characters are strangers. Your meetings, they are the property of one social class, which appears there in small numbers." So he addresses Hungarians, his compatriots, by persuading them to contribute to public life, create the institutions of national interest, the theater, the clubs, and contribute and involve all social strata of society. One of his works, Nemzeti Hagyományok, he shows national traditions. He shows the basic features, it shows the basic features of national romanticism. Okay. KÖLCSEY created the national anthem of Hungarians, the hymn. As we see, hymn is a religious poem, you know, and it is addressed to God. So this is in Hungarian. You see here the Hungarian text. Now I'll show you the English text. It starts with the lines, "O my God, the Magyar, bless with thy plenty and good cheer." It was composed in 1823, 23rd of January, and it is still our national anthem, and we celebrate this day as the Day of National Culture. He also started a new tradition, but by remembering the nation's past and by asking God to help the nation to overcome this critical time. 1823, the age of reform has not even started, so he was praying to God for more strength to overcome the difficult status of the nation and the state. István Székely is one of our main great public figures and also a very romantic personality. He was, you can see him in a typical dress of a great Hungarian aristocrat in the 1820s. He contributed a year's income of his properties, estates, to establish the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which is still our celebrated institution. This was in 1825, it was constructed, and also he contributed to the first stone bridge over the Danube, the Budapest, the Lánchíd, the chain bridge. So there were public efforts to create an infrastructure in the city, in the great cities of Hungary, and to create a new balance in society. So journalism was a great contribution of journalism was done by MIHÁLY VÖRÖSMARTY, who is our first greatly romantic poet. VÖRÖSMARTY is the first person from the Hungarians I discussed so far who came from simple origins, from a very simple family. He went to very good schools, to the Piarists, a Catholic order in Budapest. He became a tutor with a family of Hungarian aristocrat. This was one of his pupils, Mór Perccel, who was one of the generals of the Hungarian army in the freedom struggle in 1849. VÖRÖSMARTY was one of the chief editors of the journal of ATHENAEUM, when his work encapsulates on a number of issues relevant for Romanticism. And we see how the trajectory of his work also encompasses many of the aspects of Romanticism. He was the editor, VÖRÖSMARTY was the editor of the journal of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. This is the building of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which was raised from private funds, from the contribution of Székely. VÖRÖSMARTY was the first translators first translator of Shakespeare's plays Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and King Lear. In the two poems, Appeal and People, which I would like to discuss either today or at a later date, Appeal and People, we see the shift in his worldview in the course of time. One of the great Hungarian scholars, Antal Szerb, described VÖRÖSMARTY's character and work as, I quote, complexities, inner conflicts, strange ways of soul, the inner destinies of the refined man are revealed in front of us, words of which we become conscious only in the 20th century. We feel that our contents are expressed and liberated. Such lines give the meaning to poetry. We realize a truth that is important from the point of view of identification with art. VÖRÖSMARTY is the first modern poet. Even Georg Lukács, the literary scholar whose name many people know in India, the author of the theory of the novel and soul and forms, estimated that Csongor és Tünde was the best drama of the 19th century, the best Hungarian drama of 19th century, and that VÖRÖSMARTY was one of our first truly modern poet.
Right. Thank you, ma'am, for our today's lecture. Friends, this was the introduction to Hungarian Romanticism, which we of course shall carry forward in our next lecture when we have that in the next month. And just as of course we've been going through the lecture, of course certain doubts may arise in the mind of the listener, and perhaps I would like to put them across to Dr. Kovacs. And just a slight query, ma'am, you talked about Chayavad Romanticism. So is that also related to Hungarian Romanticism in any way?
Chayavad itself, there we can't see any concrete influence or any concrete contact between the two movements, Hungarian Romanticism and Chayavad. But we see very many similar trends. Right. One trend was the idea of language renewal, the work of Baratendu and the work of VÖRÖSMARTY and Kazinczy and VÖRÖSMARTY, the need that the language has to be recreated for not only cultural but also for political reasons. Also, the activities which Kazinczy and VÖRÖSMARTY performed in the area of translation. Right. Baratendu also translated a number of works, and Shakespeare, exactly, Shakespeare to Hindi.
Right, thank you for explaining that, ma'am. And just curious, around which time did Hungarian Romanticism begin? Is it around the same period as the English Romanticism, or?
It is slightly later. We know that English Romanticism we date it with the preface to the lyrical ballads, and Hungarian Romanticism was we could say that it was 1825 if we want to have a concrete date. Right. 1825, the work of MIHÁLY VÖRÖSMARTY, the Flight of Zalán.
Right.
This one of the great epics of Hungarian language, which is now dated, unlike the play drama Csongor és Tünde, from which you heard the soliloquy, or so the soliloquy of the night, and other poems of VÖRÖSMARTY, which you will hear next time.
Right, ma'am. And we also saw that you had prepared a chart where you distinguished between the characteristics of classicism versus romanticism. And in one of the points you mentioned that in classicism, citizen of the world, as opposed to the nation. Can you just clarify that a little bit, ma'am?
It is actually very strongly relevant to Hungarian Romanticism and the Romanticism of the Central and East European nations. In classicism, we see how cosmopolitan the work of Pope, Johnson, and the other writers of English literature were. They are addressed to any citizen of the world. Also, and in Hungarian literature, the nation became a very important dimension of the work and very important aim and target of the Romantic writers' work.
That clarifies the idea and the difference between the two, of course. And ma'am, also you gave example of Rushdie's Midnight's Children and the Moor's Last Sigh, and you said that certain aspects from those reflect characteristics of Romanticism. Could we take a few examples, probably, if that can be possible?
I think my main example would be the aspect of mythology.
Right.
We see how Midnight's Children, the title of the novel itself, is a mythology, creates mythology, the independence of India. So we see how a modern mythology is and how important it becomes in the life of Salim, the protagonist of the novel. And these personal mythologies were also very important in the work of the Romantic writers and poets.
Right, thank you, ma'am. We also heard from you a bit about how literature influenced music.
Yeah, that's very true. Both ways. This is both ways true. There are certain themes which were picked up from literature, the various symphonies, the various epics. This Berlioz's piece, the Faust Overture, is one of the celebrated pieces of music. There are also some other pieces of music of VÖRÖSMARTY also wrote a poem to Franz Liszt. So we see this vice versa response to music.
Right, and can we also say that the national anthem which you showed to us in Hungarian and the translation hymn, which was written in 1823, it was a result of this vice versa kind of an influence?
It was in some ways, but it had also very many classical elements.
Right.
So we see in KÖLCSEY's work, we see the mixture of classical and romantic elements. And it is really VÖRÖSMARTY, in VÖRÖSMARTY's work, when we see that he has overcome these dimensions.
Right, absolutely, ma'am. And since we have talked about Hungarian Romanticism, provided an introduction to it, could you probably suggest any book or any source where if the students want to go back and sort of read more about it?
Yes, what I could, I have brought, I mean, one main source is the poetry. You see here the Lost Rider, when much of the work of the Hungarian Romantic poets is there in the Hungarian original and in English translation. But if you want to read literary history and you want to read in detail and the argument to it, there are two books which I can recommend. One is Béla Köpecsi's History of Hungarian Literature, and the other one is Laurent Cigány's book, The Oxford History of Hungarian Literature. Both books were published, one was published in 1983, Cigány's, and Köpecsi's perhaps somewhere in the 1970s.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. And friends, with this, we bring our lecture to a close. But it's extremely significant to thank ma'am for being present in our studio and talk to us and spare her valuable time. Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, ma'am. And we would also like to, of course, extend an invitation to be here next time as well to talk more in depth on Hungarian Romanticism. So thank you so much, Dr. Kovesh. And thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.